What would make a daughter kill her parents? What twisted set of events could drive someone to betray their family for something as fleeting as a vacation? Virginia McCullough's life seemed normal, but beneath the surface, a dark secret was brewing. A deadly crime, a manipulative relationship, and a shocking motive. This is the story of how a dream turned into a nightmare. Stay tuned to uncover the chilling truth behind one of the most unimaginable betrayals. On the surface, the McCullough family in Great Baddow, Essex, appeared to lead an ordinary, peaceful life. But beneath that facade, a darker reality was beginning to unfold. The McCulloughs had lived through their share of struggles, but nothing could prepare them for what was coming. John McCullough, 70 years old, had retired from his career as a business studies lecturer, but his health was now deteriorating. Suffering from hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and the aches of aging, he found his once energetic lifestyle replaced with slow, painful routines. Yet despite his physical decline, John's mind remained sharp. His wife Lois, however, was in a much more fragile state. At 71, Lois was gripped by agoraphobia, an extreme fear of leaving her home. She rarely ventured outside, and the world outside her front door had become a distant, almost forgotten place. Their youngest daughter, Virginia McCullough, was living with them, acting as their primary caregiver. At 36 years old, Virginia had never truly left the nest. On the surface, she seemed like the model daughter, helping her aging parents, taking care of them in their time of need. But beneath her dutiful exterior, Virginia was hiding a growing sense of discontent. Virginia's life wasn't the idealized version of care and gratitude her parents believed. She was living in a reality where her dreams were stifled by debt and deception. In a desperate attempt to keep up appearances, Virginia had accumulated nearly £60,000 in debt, racking up credit card bills and loans in her parents' names. She had cleverly forged documents and hid the accumulating bills, making sure no one, not even her parents, realized the true depth of her financial crisis. Virginia had painted a picture of a responsible daughter pursuing an artistic career, but in truth, she was sinking deeper into financial ruin with every passing month. Her parents trusted her completely, believing that she was focused on her future, when in reality, she was spiraling out of control. The lie she told them was simple but effective. She was studying art and had plans for a successful career. She spun tales of future exhibitions and galleries, all while the debts mounted up. She knew they'd never approve of her financial mismanagement, so she kept it hidden, relying on her parents' trusting nature and unwavering belief in her. But Virginia wasn't just deceiving her parents. She had a partner in her schemes, someone who would prove to be far more dangerous than he first appeared. Enter her boyfriend, a man who seemed at first like the perfect partner. Charming, attentive, and seemingly supportive, he provided Virginia with the emotional validation she so desperately craved. At first, he was everything she wanted in a relationship, someone who made her feel understood, appreciated, and loved. But as their relationship deepened, so too did his manipulative influence over her. The boyfriend, whose name will remain unimportant for now, promised Virginia a life of luxury. He painted vivid pictures of the life they could have together: expensive vacations, fine dining, a carefree existence free from the weight of responsibility. He convinced her that the life she was living under her parents' roof was holding her back. He assured her that once they had the money to leave, they could escape to a world where she wouldn't have to worry about bills, responsibilities, or the crushing weight of debt. He told Virginia that the only way they could ever achieve true happiness and freedom was if she could get her hands on her parents' money. With each conversation, his words reinforced the idea that her parents, whom she had spent her whole life depending on, were now obstacles in the way of her happiness. To him, they were merely a means to an end. Virginia, already deep in financial turmoil, began to see her parents not as loved ones to care for, but as roadblocks to her escape. The boyfriend's promises of luxury and freedom became the new reality she yearned for. And slowly, Virginia started to believe that her parents' money was the key to unlocking that dream. Every time she paid off another credit card or took out another loan, the tension in her life grew until it became a suffocating pressure she could no longer bear. But the boyfriend didn't just offer her dreams, he stoked the fire of entitlement. With each suggestion, he subtly manipulated her into believing that she deserved a life of comfort and wealth. He made it clear that she should expect nothing less. And so, Virginia began to question everything. Her parents, whom she had always loved, suddenly became the villains in her life story. The luxurious vacation in the Bahamas, the dream of freedom, of escape, seemed so close, just out of reach. The debts, the lies, the promises of a better life all converged. Virginia felt trapped, but the boyfriend's voice rang louder with every passing day. You can have it all, but only if you get rid of what's holding you back. By now, Virginia had become convinced that the only way to escape was to make a permanent break. It wasn't just about getting the money anymore. It was about taking control of her life, leaving her past behind. And in that moment, something snapped. Virginia began to plot. She didn't just want a vacation, she wanted a new life. The walls she had built with lies and deceit started to collapse, and the boyfriend's influence drove her toward a decision she could never undo. But as the day of reckoning approached, a question lingered in the air. Would Virginia finally go through with it? Would she sacrifice everything for a fleeting chance at freedom? And more chillingly, how far was she willing to go? If you've made it this far, you're clearly as deep into this story as we are. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We see you and we appreciate you. Virginia's obsession with the Bahamas grew to a fever pitch. For her, it was no longer just a trip, it was an escape. Her chance to leave behind the crushing weight of responsibility and the suffocating grip of her parents. The Bahamas wasn't just a destination, it symbolized freedom, luxury, and the life she believed she was entitled to. But there was a problem: her parents. John and Lois McCullough, though caring, had grown weary of Virginia's lack of direction. They had watched their youngest daughter, now 36, live under their roof without any real ambition. They had encouraged her to pursue a career, but Virginia seemed content to live off them, unbothered by the mounting debts she had accumulated. When she approached them for help with funding the lavish trip, they refused. To them, it was just another sign of her laziness. You need to stop dreaming about vacations and start thinking about getting a job, John had told her, frustration clear in his voice. Lois echoed his sentiments, adding, We can't keep bailing you out, Virginia. It's time you take responsibility for your life. The rejection hit Virginia hard. She had long depended on her parents, but now they were telling her to figure things out on her own. The dream of a Bahamas vacation, once a distant fantasy, now seemed impossible. Her parents were stifling her, forcing her to live a life of restraint and responsibility. This only fueled her resentment and frustration, making her feel trapped in a life that wasn't hers. Enter her boyfriend. He was the one who had the answers, or so he seemed. His promises of a carefree, luxurious life began to sound like the freedom Virginia had been searching for. He reassured her that she didn't have to accept her parents' rejection. You don't need them, he said. You deserve a life of luxury. All you have to do is take control. His words were like a lifeline. He convinced Virginia that her parents, though well-meaning, were holding her back from living the life she truly deserved. To him, they weren't just being practical. They were obstacles preventing her from reaching her full potential. The more Virginia heard this, the more she believed it. They've made you think you're lazy, he continued, but you're not. You deserve everything you want. And to get it, you need to take it. At first, Virginia wasn't sure how to respond, but the more her boyfriend spoke, the clearer things became. Her parents weren't just refusing to help her, they were actively keeping her from the life she deserved. He made her feel justified in wanting more, in desiring a life of freedom and excitement, without the constraints of responsibility or debt. The Bahamas became a symbol of everything she could have if only she could escape her parents' control. Her boyfriend's assurances that they would travel, live luxuriously, and never answer to anyone became a reality she clung to. It wasn't just about a vacation anymore. It was about freedom. It was about getting away from the life that was suffocating her. Virginia now believed that the only way to make this dream real was to take the money. She could no longer rely on her parents' approval. The boyfriend had planted the seed, and now Virginia was determined to take the next step. The vacation was no longer just a getaway. It had become her escape from the reality she hated. And so, as the weight of her debts and dissatisfaction grew, Virginia began to plot how she could break free. The life she dreamed of was just one bold move away. Virginia had always been a dreamer, but now her dreams had turned darker, more desperate. The vision of a life free from the constraints of her parents, living the lavish life her boyfriend promised, consumed her thoughts. The idea of the Bahamas, sun, freedom, luxury, became her escape, but the reality was harsh. Her parents stood in the way. The frustration built, and Virginia became convinced that to secure her future, she needed to remove the barriers holding her back. The planning started slowly. Virginia knew she couldn't just ask her parents for help anymore, especially after their repeated refusals. They had been strict, telling her she needed to get a job and take responsibility. Their disapproval stung, fueling a sense of betrayal. They were no longer the supportive parents she once saw them as. They were obstacles. If she wanted to live the life she dreamed of with her boyfriend, she believed there was only one way forward. She began thinking about how she could take control of the situation. What if she could access the financial resources that would set her free? Virginia decided to act. She quietly began researching ways to incapacitate her father, John, who had been in poor health for some time. She knew her parents' vulnerability would work in her favor, and so she started looking into ways to safely, but effectively, incapacitate him. With a careful plan in place, she purchased medication and other supplies, intending to use them to bring about the change she desired. The idea was to make it seem natural, nothing too suspicious, just an unfortunate accident. But Virginia knew that her plan needed to be foolproof. She couldn't risk failure. As she continued to prepare, she also bought a knife, knowing she would need a more direct solution if things didn't go as expected. She focused on the details, making sure every step was calculated and precise. She wanted this to be clean, a way to make everything align without raising suspicion. On June 17, 2019, Virginia put her plan into motion. She made sure her father was alone and in a vulnerable state. Virginia administered the medication she had prepared, watching as he grew drowsy and eventually fell unconscious. It was the first step. Her father's death, while tragic, would allow her to gain access to the money she so desperately needed. But there was still one more obstacle. Her mother, Lois. Lois had been living with her own struggles, her agoraphobia keeping her confined to their home. She didn't leave often, but she wasn't completely oblivious to what was happening around her. Virginia feared that her mother might sense something was wrong, especially if she found her husband unresponsive. Her mind raced, and she realized she couldn't afford to take any chances. The next day, June 18th, Virginia knew she had to act quickly. The pressure was mounting. If Lois discovered what had happened, the whole plan would collapse. She couldn't let that happen. In a sudden rush of panic, Virginia decided to take matters into her own hands. With no time to lose, she confronted her mother in her bedroom. What started as a desperate act to silence her fears quickly escalated into something irreversible. Virginia's mind was clouded with the urgency of her situation. She knew she had gone too far, but she believed she had no choice. After it was done, the house fell silent. Virginia's breath quickened as the weight of her actions began to sink in, but there was no time for reflection. She had taken everything into her own hands, believing this was the only way to escape the life that had held her back for so long. Now, the dream of the Bahamas, the life of freedom she had long desired, was within reach. But even as Virginia moved to cover her tracks, she could feel the tension mounting. She knew that while the future was now hers to control, it would come with consequences she could never have anticipated. As she prepared to face the fallout of her actions, one question lingered. Was the life she had dreamed of worth the price she had paid? With her parents' bodies now lying lifeless in the house, Virginia had to act quickly. The quiet, suffocating weight of what she had just done was starting to settle in, but there was no time for remorse. The dream of escaping to the Bahamas, of living the life she had always imagined, was still within reach, but only if she could keep up the charade. The first step was to conceal the bodies. Virginia knew that she couldn't just leave them out in the open. Her father, John, was placed in a makeshift tomb in his study, a space in the house that few ever ventured into. Using breeze blocks and whatever she could find, she created a crude burial site. The thought of her father lying there, hidden beneath layers of stone and debris, didn't seem to bother her as much as it should have. Her mind was focused on the bigger picture. She had to keep the illusion alive. Her mother's body was dealt with next. Lois had been the one Virginia feared might catch on first. With a mounting sense of urgency, she wrapped her mother's body in a sleeping bag and placed it in an upstairs wardrobe. It was a makeshift hiding spot, but it would have to do. Virginia stood there for a moment, staring at the wardrobe where her mother now lay, and a cold chill ran down her spine. But there was no turning back. She shut the door and moved on. The hardest part was over, or so she thought. Living the lie was the next challenge. The world outside their home had no idea what had happened, and Virginia was determined to keep it that way. She had to control the narrative. She began crafting stories for anyone who might ask about her parents. To relatives and friends, she said they had gone on a long vacation. To medical professionals, she claimed they were too ill to be seen. She had anticipated this, and her rehearsed lies slid off her tongue with ease. No one seemed suspicious. Her story was airtight, and in her mind, it was working. But the lies didn't stop there. Virginia was living with the bodies of her parents, hiding them in plain sight, while continuing to deceive everyone around her. The facade of normalcy was critical to her plan, and she knew she couldn't let the outside world question her behavior. She had to be convincing. No cracks, no slip-ups. In her quest to maintain control, Virginia started using her mother's identity to gain access to her parents' financial resources. She took out new credit cards and used her mother's PIN numbers without hesitation. It wasn't just the money she needed. It was the lifestyle. Clothes, jewelry, and online gambling became her way of living the life she'd always wanted. The money flowed freely, all while she sat in the house, surrounded by the haunting presence of her parents' bodies. Days passed, then weeks, and still no one had caught on. Virginia felt the weight of the deception growing heavier, but the dream of the future she had promised herself was too tempting to let go. The Bahamas, the life of luxury, was just one step away. She had buried the truth under layers of lies and kept up the facade, but each passing day made it harder to ignore the reality of her actions. But for now, the plan seemed to be working. Virginia was living in the lie she had created, but as she continued to spend her parents' money and weave her stories, she knew one thing for sure: nothing would be the same again. Though Virginia's boyfriend was never directly involved in the murders, his influence was undeniable. He wasn't just a supportive partner. He was a manipulative figure who preyed on her desperation. His promises of freedom, luxury, and a life of ease consumed her, clouding her judgment and pushing her toward an irreversible decision. Every word he spoke reinforced the idea that she deserved more, that she was entitled to escape her struggles. He painted a picture of a perfect life in the Bahamas, where she could live without the constraints of debt, responsibility, or the suffocating control of her parents. Virginia, emotionally vulnerable and increasingly isolated, became fixated on the idea that this was the only way to secure the future she had always wanted. Her sense of entitlement, mixed with the boyfriend's manipulation, blinded her to the consequences of her actions. His constant assurances convinced her that her parents, who had spent their lives caring for her, were simply obstacles standing in the way of her happiness. He didn't need to tell her directly to kill them. He didn't need to say a word about the crime. His subtle encouragement, combined with Virginia's own emotional turmoil, made her believe that murder was the only way to achieve her dreams. Disappearance. After the murder. But once the deed was done, the boyfriend disappeared. After Virginia committed the murders, he vanished from her life completely. He wasn't there to console her, to help her cover up the crime, or even to enjoy the fruits of her actions. He was gone, leaving Virginia to face the overwhelming weight of her choices alone. This abandonment was more than just physical. It was a final, brutal betrayal. He had manipulated her, used her vulnerabilities, and pushed her to a breaking point, all while making promises that were never meant to be kept. The moment she needed him most, when the horror of what she had done set in, he was nowhere to be found. His disappearance underscored the depth of his manipulation. He had used her desperation to fulfill his own desires without ever having to take responsibility for the consequences. Virginia was left to carry the burden of the crime on her own, facing the fallout of a decision she'd made under his influence. His absence was a stark reminder that her dream life, promised to her by someone who never intended to stay, was nothing but an illusion. If you've made it this far, you're clearly as deep into this story as we are. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We see you and we appreciate you. It all began with a missed appointment. John McCullough had always been diligent about his health, attending regular checkups with his GP. But in September 2023, the doctor began to grow concerned when John missed his routine appointments. The absence seemed out of character for someone who had been so meticulous about his health. His wife, Lois, had also been unresponsive to follow-up calls, which only raised further concerns. The GP, uncertain of the situation but aware that something wasn't quite right, contacted the safeguarding team. A simple missed appointment spiraled into an investigation, and soon the authorities became involved. John and Lois had not been seen or heard from in weeks, and their absence was now being treated as a missing persons case. The investigation moved quickly. The local authorities began to search the McCullough home, hoping to find answers. Virginia, who had been living under the same roof, had been evasive when questioned about her parents' whereabouts. Her fabricated stories, one about a supposed vacation, another about them being too ill to see anyone, seemed to hold up at first. But as the days passed, the cracks in her story began to show. Something wasn't adding up, and the pressure mounted. Virginia had carefully constructed her life to maintain a facade of normalcy. The lies she had woven about her parents' disappearance had kept her safe for weeks, but the more she spoke, the more the authorities began to dig. The neighbors, friends, and even some distant relatives had not seen or heard from John and Lois in months. They had no explanation for their sudden disappearance. On September 15, 2023, the investigation took a dramatic turn. As police conducted a thorough search of the McCullough home, they discovered what had been hidden in plain sight: the bodies of John and Lois. Virginia's attempts to cover up the brutal reality of what had happened were now exposed for all to see. When confronted by the police, Virginia initially tried to maintain her innocence. She feigned confusion, attempting to convince the authorities that she had no knowledge of where her parents were or what had happened to them. But as the truth began to sink in and the mounting evidence became undeniable, her defenses began to crumble. In a chilling moment of clarity, Virginia confessed. The words she spoke sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. "They won't just give me the money?" It was a shocking admission of her sense of entitlement and emotional detachment from the crime. The statement was not just an acknowledgement of her actions. It was a chilling glimpse into the mind of a woman who had believed she was justified in killing her parents for their money. Virginia's confession, however, was not born out of remorse. There was no sorrow in her voice, no regret for the lives she had taken. Instead, it was a reflection of the mindset that had driven her to this point, a mindset that saw her parents not as loved ones, but as obstacles standing in the way of her desires. The shocking nature of her words revealed the depth of her emotional detachment from the violence she had committed. Her confession marked the end of the facade she had so carefully maintained for months. The carefully crafted stories, the lies about her parents' vacation, the fabricated health concerns, all of it unraveled. The cold reality of what she had done came into full view, and the consequences of her actions began to set in. As Virginia was arrested and led away in handcuffs, the full weight of her choices began to become clear. She had spent months hiding the truth, living in a lie, but now, there was nowhere left to run. The dream of the Bahamas, the life she had hoped to build, had come at a horrifying cost. The reality of what she had done, taking the lives of the very people who had cared for her, was now irreversible. The McCullough family's tragedy had ended in the most unimaginable way, with the youngest daughter responsible for the deaths of the very people she was meant to love and protect. The arrest marked the beginning of Virginia's journey through the justice system, but the damage was already done. The dream she had chased for so long had left nothing but destruction in its wake. Virginia's fate was sealed when she was officially charged with 2 counts of murder. The gravity of the charges became even clearer as she appeared before the magistrates, facing the consequences of the brutal killings that had shocked everyone who knew her. The trial was set into motion, and soon, the horrifying details of her actions began to emerge in court. In July 2024, Virginia's guilt was undeniable. She pleaded guilty to both murders, fully aware that the trial would lay bare the depths of her betrayal. The prosecution presented their case, describing not just the brutal nature of the killings, but the shocking aftermath of Virginia's actions. It wasn't enough for her to simply take her parents' lives. She had robbed them of their dignity, even in death. For weeks, she had lived in the same house as their bodies, continuing to spend their money as if nothing had happened. Virginia used her mother's identity to withdraw money, buy clothes, jewelry, and indulge in online gambling, all while hiding the brutal truth of what she had done. The court was gripped by the sheer audacity of Virginia's behavior. It wasn't just the crime itself that left everyone horrified. It was her complete emotional detachment. She had taken everything from her parents, their lives, their money, and even their peace after death. This calculated deception revealed the full extent of her greed and entitlement, making the case all the more chilling. On October 11, 2024, the court returned with a verdict. Virginia was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 36 years. The judge emphasized the severity of her actions, calling attention to the fact that Virginia had violated the most sacred trust between parents and children. Not only had she taken her parents' lives, but she had done so for personal gain, driven by selfish desires, and without remorse. As Virginia was led away in handcuffs, the reality of the consequences she faced began to sink in. The dream life she had once imagined, the freedom she had believed was just one step away, now seemed like a distant fantasy. Her conviction marked the end of a tragedy that had shattered the McCullough family forever, one that could never be undone. Virginia McCullough's tragic decision to murder her parents for money was driven by a disturbing mix of entitlement and manipulation. What should have been a life of potential and possibility was permanently altered by her actions. The lives of her parents, who had spent their lives caring for her, were stolen in the most brutal way, leaving behind a family shattered and a community in disbelief. Virginia's fantasy of escaping her troubles with a dream life in the Bahamas became a nightmare that ended in irreversible consequences. This case is a chilling reminder of how manipulation in relationships, especially when combined with emotional vulnerability and a false sense of entitlement, can lead to devastating outcomes. Virginia's actions highlight the dangerous power of unchecked desires and the lengths people can go to when they believe they deserve something without considering the cost. Reflecting on this, it's important to understand the dangers of manipulation and the emotional toll it can take. Let this serve as a warning. Never underestimate the consequences of letting toxic influences control your decisions. If you found this story compelling and thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into chilling true crime stories. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on this case. What do you think drove Virginia to commit such an unforgivable act? We'd love to hear from you. Remember, the case of Virginia McCullough serves as a chilling reminder of how someone's greed and manipulation can destroy a family, leaving lives shattered in the wake of a crime that could have been avoided. Stay tuned for more in-depth investigations into the darkest corners of true crime.